Hello again, we are on our third day of talks and research and stuff. I'm here with Philipp Zahn. He's from St. Gallen's University in Switzerland. He's a professor there, he's an economist, and he's going to talk about model design. Thanks. Mechanism design.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for the introduction. So what I'm going to do is, I will make this short. This will be a crash course, basically, outlining some basic concepts, in the hope that we can transition afterwards in the concrete design or potential design ideas about what an auction mechanism or Statebox or any kind of ICO should look like, could look like. Okay, so mechanism design is well, the basic task basically, or the very abstract idea is we have an allocation problem. For instance, we have a public good. Now the idea could be people on this island gather and they want to build a bridge to the mainland. That would be a public good. Or we have a painting which we want to allocate to one of us in the room. Or we have some tokens that we want to allocate to a number of people. That is the basic task. And of course, we're not just interested in any kind of allocation, but we are interested in understanding what could be a good allocation be. And mechanism design basically introduces a language to formalize this and to provide a stage to do analysis on this and to investigate what kind of mechanisms do exist which have desirable properties. Now the basic setting is an idea where you have a number of players. Or sometimes also called agents. And you have a decision, so maybe for the computer scientists this is set. This is also set. And D is just a decision problem. Now the overall framework is very general, and of course the details matter quite a lot for what you want to do with that. Examples of this could be or another example could be something like this. And I will say something about what this actually is, also in a minute. Okay? So a decision problem, for instance, could be just a single decision to build a bridge or not. Yeah, build a bridge to the mainland or not. It could be we have a painting from Monet, and we want to allocate it with among us in the group of agents, and this means we have each agent will get an allocation which is either 0 or 1. Yeah, and of course we have some constraint because we have just one Monet, we have not fortress. And of course you can easily see that because it's so generic you can easily extend this. So you could say, well, maybe this is not 0, 1, but this is a natural number, and then you have a constraint which says there is a fixed natural number and this is the number of tokens we want to allocate. Yeah? And you can think about other constraints. Now the important part, thinking about the public good like the bridge or the painting is, how do we evaluate this? Yeah. So if I'm asking you, well, how should I allocate the money? Maybe there's someone in the room who just hates it. And maybe someone else is a real fan of it. So we need some ways of educating or allocating value and thinking about how do people make decisions, and for that we are introducing what is called a utility function, or sometimes also a payoff function for each individual. And this will look for each individual. This is a mapping from, I will say something about the theta here in a second, into the reals. So this part, forgetting about the theta, this part should be clear. Well, if we want to evaluate whether a bridge is good or not, we need to know what the decision is. If it's 0, we will have some value. If it's 1, we will also have some value. And it's clear, overall, this is indicated by I ranging over the number of players. This will be different for different people. Someone who's owning a guest house here and is just in this island for 2 days or for 2 weeks in the year, he will have a certain value for a bridge to the mainland. Someone who's commuting on a daily basis will have a different value. Similar is true for a painting or in the case of tokens. Now, what is the theta here? This theta basically is also a set, and this encapsulates basically what we call private information. So this part is, in some sense, summarizing what your individual evaluation of the bridge, the painting or a token or the number of tokens basically is. Yeah. And the idea here, of course, is that once I know Jeller's private evaluation of a Monet, and I know the decision of allocating it to him or not, I can say what his evaluation will be. Yeah. Now note, I will be from the bird's eye perspective. There are some structural assumptions that I have to make that I can represent this in this form. Yeah. I will neglect this here. I'm just assuming this works, and I think in the context of tokens, for instance, this is a very plausible assumption. Now, what are we interested in? We are interested in the first step to make a decision. That means, if I look at this room and I have a painting that I want to allocate, we have to think about how can we allocate, what is the rule to allocate this painting? What is it that we need, what makes a good allocation in that sense? And of course, what we actually mean is, if we put our hat on and say, suppose I could observe everyone's evaluation here, so I had access to this theta of everyone, I could of course say, well, one rule could be, the one with the highest evaluation should get the painting. Yeah, that would be one rule of allocating. More generally, the rule will be just a mapping from the profile of this private information into a decision. Yeah? As I said, one idea could be I'm looking around at who has the highest valuation, and this person should get the painting. Another one would be if we're building a bridge, the bridge will have some costs. We are summarizing the valuations in the group of us, and if the valuation, sum of it is larger than the cost of building the bridge, we should actually implement the bridge. Yeah? Yes.
Are there some similarities between these, like D function in that way and a social choice function?
I will come back to this in a minute. Yes, it is actually, but it's not complete yet. For the single reason that I assumed before that this is private information, and here I'm just acting like, what should I do if I had access to it? Which will then determine what kind of rules in the end I would like to implement. Now, of course, to get this done, I need something. If I want to allocate, just a second, if I want to allocate a painting, let's say, I of course can ask you, what is the evaluation, but that will not be credible in a sense because every one of you has an incentive to say something different, maybe very high. So what I need is a second component, I need a transfer. So classically in a painting I could allocate it and I will ask you, well, if you get it, you have to pay me something. Whereas everyone else who does not get the painting will not pay it something. Or in the case of the bridge, if we're allocating the bridge, we are just dividing the costs by the number of persons in the room. So everyone has to pay a share. So you had a question?
Yeah, so the theta, is that a product of all the theta I?
Yes, so this theta I is basically, well actually...
So theta is the prime variation, and the theta and the D function, that's a product of all together, right?
Yeah, like this. Can you see? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, what is a transfer? A transfer is basically mapping the theta into the space here where transfers live. Yeah. Of course, whether this is the right type for this, we can debate, but this is the classical way we think about this. That we can use the wheels to represent the tails. And now, coming back to your question, what is kind of a social choice function? A social choice function here in this setting is basically a function f that maps theta into the product of E times R n. Yeah? So given a profile of private information, I'm saying what is the allocation, and I'm also saying who has to pay what, or who receives what. Yeah? But also, it's not necessarily clear that the transfer always has to be something that is paid by someone, but it could also be that someone receives. Okay?
I think the theta are sets that represents value that you give things.
In principle, they can be more general. In the context here, what I will talk about, they will always represent a single element, like an evaluation. Like, in the painting case, it will be your willingness to pay the painting.
Yeah, but so you need to impose any kind of order structure? Like when you say they represent an evaluation, how much are you willing to pay?
Yeah.
Basically, you can compare different amounts of money, so you have a full structure.
Yes.
Is this necessary in practice, or there are cases in which sets represent really like just sets?
in almost all applications in the context of auctions, there is structure like this, that you make a simple assumption. And in fact, what we actually impose is an assumption in combination with transfers, the evaluation of transfers, and what this actually is about. Let me just point this out. I think it's a good point to just directly make this.
We can take the third.
Yeah, this looks like I don't want to touch it actually.
There's something happened to it.
Yeah, I don't know. It wasn't me.
It wasn't me. Neil?
Neil?
It was me.
So, the assumption we typically make is that, I will also explain what this means here in a second. So what we basically impose is that the actual payouts that we use can be separated into two parts, namely the evaluation of how we like the thing, which will be this is a V. And this depends on this thing here and the actual I plus the transfer that is happening. Yeah, so what is this head thing here? The head thing is basically, suppose I'm asking you for evaluation and you give me some information about it. Yeah, I'm asking Fabrizio, how much do you value Monet? And he says, I don't like Monet, it's maybe €5. Yeah. So I would put €5 in. Whereas in fact, that's what he says. But internally he thinks, oh my God, I mean, I really love it. I love it like hell. That would be theta I. Yeah. Of course, assuming that every one of us gives an announcement, this is actually what, according to a certain rule, if we follow this announcement, is implemented by D. Yeah, this is again this thing here. And of course, the assumption we impose, and here I'm coming to your point here, is we are putting this into what is sometimes called a quasi-linear form. What it is doesn't matter here, but it should tell you that this is a strong assumption already imposed here, that transfers are linearly added to the evaluation that we have. Yeah? Again, these details are not important for today's talk, but they are in principle important because they will restrict what is possible to implement as an optimal mechanism or not. Again, this is the standard formalization that you use in auction design. There are exceptions of this, but this is the standard formulation. Okay, now, so far so good. This is basically just setting the scene. Now what we're interested in is actually, we don't have access to this theta. So if I want to auction off the painting of Manet, I don't know evaluations. So I have to think about a way of doing this. How do I do this? This is where a mechanism comes in. And the mechanism is actually something relatively simple. So it basically consists of a mechanism, consists of a tuple, which has two elements, M and G. M is what we call a message space. This is, again, a set constructed like this. It is like, I'm basically giving you a set of actions you can take, or what you can communicate. It could be, for instance, in the auction case, it could be, I'm giving you a range of prices that you can send to me. Yeah? And this, the overall last message that I get, is just this product out of different messages. Yeah? And what is G? Well, G is mapping these messages into, probably not really surprisingly, into a decision and some transfers. Yeah. Now, to fill this with an example, I could have a mechanism that says, you choose a price between 0 and 100,000, and I will allocate one good, the painting, by saying, well, if I get, though the person who has actually the third highest evaluation, or the person who gives me the third highest price will get the good, and he will have to pay the 5th highest price, assuming that he has sufficiently many credits. Would be maybe not the best way to do it or the most clever way, but it would be one way of allocating a good. Okay. Now, yeah.
Is this something like a game in normal form?
I will come to this exactly. So, give me 5 more minutes and you will see the connection. So, what you should always think about is the design space basically is how we structure the message space and how we design this function G. That's the 2 parts. You know, you can think about also very simple mechanism, very simple message space is just 0, 1. Yeah. Exactly. And in fact, if you think about voting systems very often will have this component here, where you can say, yes, I'm voting for a candidate or not. And there will be a function, and there will be actually no payouts, or no transfers. At least not within the mechanism. Ex post later on, maybe via taxes, there will be, but it's not modeled by the mechanism itself. So, what we can see is for a particular message, we will also, I'm just writing this here out that you can see it. So if we have a particular vector of messages, what we will see then, what we will have is basically GD of M, GT1 of M, GTN of M. Okay, so you can't, it should be clear, you probably can't read it, but these are the transfer part and this is just a decision to be made. Now, the big question, of course, is, in the case of the painting, or tokens, or the public good, how the hell should we choose this mechanism? What should it be? Now, if you think about it, suppose I fix a mechanism. I just give you the one that I mentioned before. So, the one with the 3rd highest price gets the good, and the 5th highest price has to be paid then by this person. You may wonder, what will be the result of this as the mechanism? How will people behave? And for that, you need some theory, some behavioral theory of what the agents will do given a particular mechanism. Otherwise, you'd have no idea of, you know, suppose I'm giving the mechanism I have, or I'm comparing it to another mechanism, what people will do. And to think about what mechanism I should choose, I need to understand, I need to have a theory how people will behave. Okay? Now this is, coming back to Jules' question, this is exactly where the game theory kicks in here. So far there is no game theory. I'm just mentioning this representation and there is no game theory happening. Now, how does game theory kick in? Well, we will use game theory to derive predictions of what will individuals do given or facing a particular mechanism and what will be the result. And of course, using this, we will step back and then wonder how should we choose the mechanism given that we understand completely how people will react to different mechanisms, which mechanism should we choose to achieve a certain goal. Yeah? For instance, what could the goal be? To reiterate this, it could be that we want to have the person with the highest evaluation should get the good, and he should pay something. Yeah? Again, with referencing the social choice function before. So what we will use game theory to implement to understand what people do, and then we will kind of tune the mechanism such that it leads to an outcome which is exactly in line with the social choice function we would like to impose. Okay, now for that we will need a short interlude, because if you want to understand the part where game theory kicks in, you need to understand a bit what game theory is. Okay?
Well, the third question, like the D,
yeah.
For instance, if you have a sale where you're always selling, D would be unit or something?
This
capital D and G?
This year?
Yeah.
Well,
it's
in
a
this
decision for the entire auction, right?
Yes. D could be, for instance, in the case of a token sale, we have Ym. This is element of Rn plus, it will be only positive. You can't assign negative tokens. And the condition is that the sum of y's is smaller or equal to the budget that you fix ex ante, and budget is just an element of R. Okay, that would be basically the formalization of it. And you can see that this is just, if you think about it, a single element is just one step ahead. And of course, you know, again, this could be the natural numbers as well, whatever kind of restriction we have. Yeah? And I will come back to this issue, how this domain actually looks like, because this is important. It will determine to some degree what you can actually kind of achieve in choosing an optimal mechanism. Another question? Yeah.
So what are these messages?
Well, first of all, in general, they can be all kinds of stuff. In most cases, in most practical applications, they will be, when we reference this kind of setting here, we are actually only interested in this part here, then they will be single item information sets. Like, I ask you what is your evaluation, and you will give me a message. Or I ask you what is the price that you want to bid, and this will be the message space. Yeah? And of course, again, this also, I mean, in some sense, this message space also is at least partially determined by what we actually have here. Yeah? It could be that I just need to understand whether you have a higher evaluation than something. Yeah? And I don't need to actually understand whether it's completely like this or like that or like that. Okay, now.
But the mechanism could be a dynamic process like an eBay auction.
We will, yeah, exactly, but then would you not just have time in your message?
Well, alternatively,
wait a
you could
second.
do a composition.
Probably Philipp knows.
Wait a second. So, in principle, you are right, but again, I will now show how this maps into a normal form game. And in a normal form game, as you know, you can express dynamics by just basically increasing the strategy space. So the normal form will actually represent some dynamics.
So the message is going to represent your contingent strategy.
Exactly. You could think about this as well, like changing the message space could be a timing where you basically over time have different messages that you send. But again, if you think about it, I can just, from a game theoretic point of view, I could just ask you directly beforehand to submit your bits. From a game theory point of view, this is, these are subtleties. I don't want to dwell that much on it. I will come back to it at the end when we talk about what could be a reasonable auction design. Okay. Now, just to make sure that this is clear.
I mean, presumably you could have like, I don't know, two-phase auctions. You do some bidding, and then after that, a new auction opens up. So that opens up the way to lots of compositional.
Yes, you could do that, but again, the question is why don't you compose it? Principle. You could do it.
Because we like compositionality.
Okay, fair enough. Then we have to invent a compositional theory of mechanism design, which we should do. I'm the first one to admit it. But again, remember that I'm presenting the classical stuff, and always remember that you can always explode basically the strategy space ex ante. Yeah. So that's a thing you can do. So a short interlude. How does this actually relate to a game? I will not be fully explicit, but I'm trying to give you an intuition, and for some people who know something about game theory, at that point it will be already quite obvious. So a game in normal form is normally represented by a number of players, strategies, and a payoff function. So U is mapping S into Rn. Yeah. An example of this, the prisoner dilemma. You have cooperate, defect, cooperate, defect. If both cooperate, they get 3-3. If one of them defects, he gets more, the other guy is screwed, and vice versa, and in this outcome, both defect. Yeah. So this is a game in normal form. You can represent it in the case of two players by this bimatrix. This is the representation. These are the payoffs. And now, of course, representation is followed by solution. That means what is the prediction that we can derive? In the case of the prisoner dilemma, one solution concept you can apply is eliminating dominated strategies. And here, this is simple. You can basically always say that cooperate is always better than defect. You see this, so 3 is less than 4, 1 is less than 2. So I can basically erase this. This is symmetric. What is left is this. So the prediction based on this solution concept would be you choose the defect. Okay, what is the relation now between the mechanism and this normal form game? Well, first of all, note, if I think about this as n players, I already have this. Now the strategy space, I can just say the strategy space is the message space. The only thing which is left is, and I'm hand waving a bit, I don't want to go into that details, is how does the private information and the utility that I have defined before here map into this? Yeah, but you have to trust me, you can do this, it's just not interesting for the audience, I think. Bottom line is, a mechanism basically establishes a normal form game. In the way I introduce the mechanism, it is basically inducing a normal form game in this form. Okay. What is the consequence of that? Because we now have a game theoretic notion, we can apply a solution concept like dominated strategies. That means we can derive, given the mechanism and the game it induces, what is the outcome, what is the solution concept that is implied by it.
In that matrix, shouldn't be 3, 3 the solution.
No. Think about it. So suppose this is player 2.
You can switch to 4 then.
You are player 1. So in case, so the idea of what, look at, suppose you are player 1, and you're looking at action C. Well, you see if the other guy plays C, what you should do is actually you should defect. Yeah. So I'm player 1.
Oh no, but you're, I'm thinking about minimizing. I saw them as tiers of prison. So I don't want to go to 4, I want to go to 3.
Sorry, this is positive. Positive is better. So this is for me. This is,
okay,
like,
that is true, yeah.
Okay, sorry, I should have made that clear. But the idea is that the reals basically is the order you use the order of the reals, and more is better.
Yeah. Okay.
So you have an incentive to be here. Both have them, so you will end up here.
Yeah. If you go.
That's actually a nice example of the difference between payoffs and outcomes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Utilities and outcomes.
Exactly. Which actually is it's in this case very often confusing, because some people really think about this as years of prison where you would actually have to transform it. Okay, now, so let me just highlight this. This is one way of solving this game. There are other versions of this. And in particular, relevant for mechanism design is one other. So we have dominated strategies, and we have what is sometimes called, what is not sometimes, what is called the Bayesian-Nash equilibrium. And in principle, there are other solution concepts which I will ignore, and I will also focus on the dominated strategies here because this is the simplest one. I'm just mentioning, to a similar degree where you have freedom in modeling games and choose a solution concept, you have a similar kind of leeway in thinking about what is a game and what is the concept that I'm actually trying to apply. Okay? Is this clear so far? Okay. Now, what could be an example of this? So let me just, something you may have noted, you may know is a second price auction. A second price auction is a simple mechanism. It is, I have a message space where I'm asking for your bid. The person with the highest bid will be allocated a good. And what he has to pay is not his bid, but it's the second highest bid. Yeah. Now this is a game, and you can actually show, we can briefly go through that. If you model this as a game, there is a strategy which is weakly dominant. What is the strategy? Sorry, Anil, I thought you will answer it. So it's a second price, and I should say, because I haven't, a sealed bid. So it means every one of you is submitting a bid, I see it, and that's it. And then what I'm doing, looking at it, and I see, Neil had the highest bid, Victor was second, so Neil gets the good and he has to pay what Victor actually bid. Okay? So you can show that this is a weakly dominant strategy. How do you do this? So my claim is basically that everyone should bid according to this strategy. And my claim is that this is an equilibrium according to this. It's an equilibrium in the sense that it's a weakly dominant strategy. How does it work? Well, just think about, suppose there are two cases basically you have to consider. Suppose B1 is larger than your theta 1. Is this an equilibrium strategy? Assuming, keep in mind that we keep all the other strategies fixed, so everyone else is bidding according to his evaluation. Well, what can happen here is you can get screwed, because this could happen. Your bid could just be higher than the next highest evaluation, which was actually higher, which is the second highest bid. So you will get a good, but you will have to pay a second highest bid, which is larger than your own evaluation. You will make a loss. You will not do that. So it's certainly not better in compared to play this, to play beyond. And you can make a symmetric argument for bidding below, which is, if you do this...
So Philip, I guess the assumption is here that you want to get the good, but you don't want to pay any more than theta because that's your value that you placed on it.
Well, the question is, if you have a linear, erase it, if you have a very simple utility function, a linear form of this. I didn't mention this, I should have. Something like this.
Yeah.
You get your valuation and you pay what if you get it,
Yeah.
of course. Yeah? If this is the case, then what my claim is, this is actually an equilibrium of this game.
Yeah.
And the way you can argue is exactly if you bid above, then there can be then someone else can have an evaluation which is larger than yours. This will be his second largest bid. You have to pay it, so this will be negative. Yeah, and therefore it's dominated.
Yeah, yeah.
And vice versa, if you do a bit below, what can happen is that you bid, and your this can happen. So you bid something which is smaller than the bid which is second highest, which means you will not get a good, even so if you would just bid something higher, you would actually get a positive utility. Yeah.
So in what sense is the second place auction better than the first place auction?
It's not better necessarily.
Because I guess you can make a very easy argument for first place auction that you should also bid what you value, no?
No, you should not.
Really?
No.
Oh, okay.
And the reason is, if you, well, for a simple reason. Here, well, this is, okay, we're getting into details. The situation that I can apply here is I can apply a strategy or a solution concept which is exactly this dominated strategy. The case in the case of the first price auction, there will be no solution in this form because it's not a dominant strategy to bid your own evaluation. There is nothing like that equivalent. What I can do is I can do what is called the Bayesian-Nash equilibrium, and that is you think about it, who else is in the room, who else has some evaluation, and then depending on that you will bid. And what you can show is that there will be an equilibrium where you will not bid exactly your evaluation, but you will shade it down by some kind of fraction, depending on the distributional assumption in the back. What is the rationale behind this? If you always bid just exactly your evaluation, your expected utility is zero. You will always get the good, potentially, but if you get it, your transfer is exactly so high that you will not be left with anything.
Well, just a question. Obviously, when you try to evaluate these optimal strategies on that, are you supposing that the other players are rational?
Yes, at the moment I am. Yeah.
So, for instance, in the first bid case, you say, okay, the rational thing to do is to bid a bit less of what you estimate the value to be according to blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
But then the problem is, this is supposing that all the other people do the same. But what happens if in the room there are people like, I mean, like Paolo just said, he thought that just by, beat the value. So how can you take into account this? Because
well, the first one is, I mean, keep in mind, this is just, I'm keeping the game as given. One question where you are heading is basically, what is the reasonable solution concept that I want to apply? Because note, in the case of the second price auction, there is something stronger because I basically can ignore what the rationale of others is. I have for myself a dominant strategy to do something. In the case of the first price auction, I have to take into account how the others are reasoning. Yeah? And of course, this is sensitive to these assumptions. Yeah? Now, in principle, you can also ask, what is kind of the timing? Actually, I didn't want to go into these details yet, but let me just answer this. So suppose I'm having a solution concept which says, once the private information has revealed, so I'm acting like everyone knows what is around, I would like to have a situation where no one would like to deviate. In that sense, I can kind of counter this from a design perspective by requiring some robustness in the mechanism. In a pure game theoretic sense, I can't. Yeah. Or I have to change the solution concept, I have to change the basic underlying game theoretic setup. And one word on this, there are of course people trying to do this. I mean, people are working on this. Again, the question is, and this is a general issue if you leave rationality assumptions, is what do you assume instead? And how is it actually, what do you pose basically? That's why it's important for some designs to at least consider the idea that you want to have something which is relatively robust, in a sense that maybe it's not so really important whether you know the individual distributions. So, okay? Now, just briefly, and then I will stop and I think we should come into a discussion. So what I basically try to argue here is that you start with an allocation problem. Like in this setup, you have something like this. This is a setup you consider. You have an allocation problem like allocating tokens, a painting, or public good. You consider a mechanism. like this. The mechanism is inducing a game. You apply a solution concept, you will get an equilibrium. And now, of course, mechanism design is basically about re-engineering. It's basically about how can we go back. Yeah. And of course, where do you want to go back? How do you want to go back? That is determined basically by your social choice function, by what you want to implement. And the question is, can you somehow bring the mechanism and the outcome that is achieved in accordance with the social choice function you want to implement? Yeah, this is basically, I mean, it's a sketch, of course. Details matter as usual, but this is the basic task that you have in mechanism design. And of course, as economists, most often we are interested in allocations which we could call efficient. An efficient allocation of a good, for instance, like painting, would be that the person with the highest evaluation should get it. If he doesn't get it, then something is wrong, because if his payoff looks like this, we can only think about redistributing afterwards so that he will actually be willing to kind of sell it. Yeah. Now, the mechanism design literature basically is concerned with understanding under which conditions is it possible to implement particular social choice functions. And of course, if it would be always possible, then this would be no theory, because then we could, and we could basically go home. The thing is, it's not always possible, and the details matter in a sense that the question is, what is the message space? What is the allocation that you kind of implement? What is the structure, the domain on what you want to implement? Is it just, let's say, as in an election where you don't have access to transfers, or just a single decision? It's different if you compare to, you want to allocate, let's say, a number of tokens. Okay. Let me just add one thing. These setups are well understood, and it's also well understood for all this kind of combinations of what happens if we have this special form, what happens if we have a different form, what kind of mechanisms do exist. It's also understood that there are various impossibilities. Sometimes it's just not possible to implement an allocation that we would like to achieve. This is in particular the case in public good settings or in taxation settings. In auction settings, it's a bit less, well, kind of an oversimplification, but it's less severe than in these public domains. Now, I would like to stop with one principle which is important to understand, and that is, if you look at this, you may think like there's a line here around.
Is the blue one with sticker? Some of them, right?
Yes, yours. So you can think about this. Searching in this space may actually be a daunting task. So how can we solve this? Well, what helps is what is called the revelation principle.
Is that what the rapture comes?
Wait, what?
Rapture.
Rapture.
Revelations.
Not getting undressed. I mean,
I don't think it's the end of the world.
The revelation principle says that for the class of mechanisms that I've been talking about, we don't need to look in the whole space. We can look for what is called a direct mechanism. And what is a direct mechanism? Direct mechanism is basically just saying, well, substitute m by the uncertainty that we have. Basically substitute m by the theta. Instead of thinking about something complicated, having a complicated auction format, I can just directly ask you, Neil, what is the evaluation? And if it's possible to find a mechanism that has an equilibrium which is implementing a social choice function I want, I know every time I find a mechanism there will always be also a direct one which does the same, which leads to the same equilibrium, which is reducing the task of what I have to do here quite substantially. Okay. Now, let me close with 3 remarks. This, of course, is, as Fabrizio pointed out, is based on assuming classical rationality. I should also say that I haven't considered any kind of complication of complexity. And this is just a second. The issue is, some of the mechanisms we know which will perform very well, for instance, what is called VZG, so Vickery-Clark-Groves. This is a mechanism which performs relatively well. It has theoretical, very nice properties, but it's complex. And it's if you try to explain to human players, they have a hard time of understanding. Very often they are just not understanding the consequences of what they are doing. And
it's some informal psychological complexity, not computational.
It's actually both. It's actually hard, if you play it with human beings, it's hard, but it's also hard in a complex sense to implement it, which is actually a second kind of question. I haven't talked about this. I mean, this is a theoretical construct. Of course, you have to implement it. And in the case of an online auction, for instance, you have to implement it in code, and you have to guarantee that certain properties hold, and that you're not introducing some loopholes.
And when you said hard, do you mean like complexity measure
Yes.
or just complicated?
Complexity measures as well. Yeah. And this is what is in what is called algorithmic game theory or algorithmic mechanism design, a big topic, kind of finding trade-offs between what is optimal on some dimension here from a theoretical point of view, but it may have less desirable properties from a computational point of view, so how can we trade off this? And I should also say that other factors outside of this model are also relevant. So in the second price auction, or any kind of simultaneous bid auction, or in some other formats, I'm actually asking you directly to reveal your full information. Now, this is not modeled here, but it of course requires that you trust me. Yeah? If you feel like, well, I'm not so sure whether I really would like to go full in and I will inform you completely about my evaluation, it may make sense to consider mechanisms which are a bit different, which are not direct, but are indirect, but have this notion of I'm revealing information, for instance, as time goes by. And in practice, these mechanisms where I reveal information over time and not just directly, I basically unveil myself as you are, a big rapture. There may be a reason for this why not to do. But again, in this case, this is not modeled inside this framework. So it's a concern that is coming from outside, which you can, to some degree.
Modeling the auctioneer as an agent.
Yes, so in some sense, this is always, translating this into practice always means to have some trade-offs and also have some evaluations coming from outside. Okay, at that point I would stop. If there are no questions, and I think afterwards we should discuss a bit more into details. What does it mean for concretely implementing the tokens? Okay, but it's a setting to see. Do you have a question?
I just want to say, intuitively, it looks very nice to implement, let's say, a CPM role. And then you can do your complexity studies just by including the state space doing model checking.
Yeah. That's one. Yeah. I'm open to that.
Very nice.
Yeah. I should also say one of the things which people have done, which works relatively well, in particular, if you want to check it, if you want to test what is going on, that you run a series of experiments with human beings, just basically kind of prototyping it and really testing that you don't make stupid mistakes, or that there is something strange going on, that maybe people don't understand part of the design, and they end up doing something which you didn't expect, which is not according to theory, but which if you think about it and you come up with a different design, you may just see that this is a problem which can be avoided. And for instance, having this issue of I'm basically revealing all information at one point in time, this could be a thing which is not part of the model here, because for the individual it doesn't matter whether it does it immediately or over time, but it can make a difference in practice. And that's why sometimes you really would like to have an empirical counterpart, and also of course consider external factors, not modeled in that framework. And of course people are also working on integrating this stuff. This is not just people are looking at that and think like, oh, it doesn't work, so we stop. People are working on it. Okay.
So the obvious question then, has anyone done a compositional form of auction theory, auction design?
I'm not aware of it in the sense as you think about compositionally. That's certainly not. What people have considered, and for instance, I know people who do empirical studies on this, is the following situation. Suppose you have a voting system where before you vote, you actually determine the threshold. Now, in principle, from a game theory point of view, it's not clear why you would like to separate these issues. You could just do it in one go. Fact is, if you do it, people will decide differently. There will be, for instance, they are sometimes considering the notion of what I do in the first stage, so setting the rules basically allows them ex post in the second stage then to implement better decisions. Whereas if they do it simultaneously, they will not be able to get this. So theoretically, I'm not aware of it, and I would be surprised, as I said, in the way you think about this. I should also say, maybe which is a bit going in this direction, what people, of course, theoretically thought through, I haven't touched this here, is I haven't touched constraints, like, do I actually have to commit to the auction, or is it possible that I just run away ex post? Suppose, I'm looking at what I get and I think, fuck it, this is not for me, I don't want it. Or is it actually so that people make a decision before and think about, is it actually rational for me to participate in the auction in the first place? Yeah? If you impose these constraints, what will happen is they just make it harder and harder to find mechanisms which are implementing something that you want. But that's as we expect. If we put more constraints on the problem, it'll be less likely that we can solve it. Okay, thanks.